Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami of March 11, 2011 raised a number of important issues about Japan's future and the world's future as well, not least of which was the issue of energy security. The devastation at the Fukushima Daiichi Nuclear Power Plant has called into question the future of nuclear power generation, not only in Japan but worldwide. The first panel of Japan Futures Initiative Spring Symposium 2012 was devoted to the topic of energy security. Discussion was chaired by David DeWitt, the Vice President of Programs at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Panelists were Akira Igata, a doctoral student in the Graduate School of Law at Keio University and working group member of the Independent Investigation Commitment on the Fukushima Daiichi Nuclear Accident. John Kirton, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto, Director of the G8 Research Group and Co-Director of the G20 Research Group at the Munk School of Global Affairs. And James Manicom, SSHRC Postdoctoral Fellow at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Comments were provided by Julia Kulik. What follows is the complete discussion of the Energy Security Panel at the Japan Futures Initiative Spring Symposium 2012.
Welcome, everyone. I look forward over the day, I'm sure, as we all do, to get to know one another, because I know that we don't all know each other at this moment. As David mentioned, you have microphones in front of you, and those will respond automatically to your intervention, so you don't have to worry about that. These two mics are here to facilitate the recording. So we're going to have to play a little bit of musical chairs as I invite each speaker. I'll ask them to come up and speak from here. And then during the open questions, we'll just try and ensure that everyone speaks loudly and clearly. And Chris will do his best to pick up not only your voice, but your face as you intervene and participate. So it's a pleasure to open this session. We had a terrific start last night at dinner with John's masterful presentation. And now we're going to look at the specific focus of this symposium in terms of three major areas of concern: disaster management, energy security, and multilateral cooperation, all in the context of what happened just about a year ago in Japan. The first session is on energy security, and obviously there is some remarkable relevance to today's affairs, not just a year ago, but we should, as John did last night, put this in a larger context. Energy security has been certainly part of international affairs for a number of millennia. You know, it's not all that long ago that one referred to the importance of the extension of and the building of empires, and how it was as important for the armies that marched across the world to ensure that they had food, water, and other energy-related resources at their disposal, as it was for them to have strong strategic initiatives and leadership. The issue of access to resources has been with us, therefore, for a very long time. Perhaps in the modern era, we can, and sitting in Canada, we can most readily reflect back on the time leading up to and then through the Second World War, when the issue of Canada as a secure location for energy resources for the United States and for the Western war machine was so terribly important, and acknowledging that wherever one looked from the 1940s through to 2012, access and control over energy remains a critical concern. I think what is different here, and what will be highlighted in today's opening panel, is it's not just the access and control of energy, is that now with the new kinds of technologies, we have not just the question of energy as a capability, and the control and use of energy in terms of the policy domains and how it can be played in terms of the classic notion of intent, but that specifically with nuclear technologies, we have the introduction of the phenomenon and the dilemma of dual-use issues, that the emergence and development and proliferation of nuclear technology came with it not just a promise of extraordinary access to various kinds of energy and the ongoing political challenges around access and control, but the fact that nuclear technology for peaceful means, for peaceful purposes, was embedded on the assumption that you could indeed not only monitor the development of nuclear technology, but you could appreciate and trust the intent of those who controlled it. And we all know that one of the major dilemmas we now face is that the emergence of nuclear technology comes with it the proliferation of dual use, and that creates new kinds of challenges. So the opening session today on energy security, definitely, obviously, a focus on Japan. We have 3 very interesting presentations in front of us. Each individual, I believe, has been afforded about 15 to 20 minutes to speak. Akira Igata comes to us from Japan, from Keio University, and among other things, I understand, was a participant in this study that led to the report on Fukushima, and was actually involved and may have held what we used to call holding the pen, but actually the keyboard in drafting the report. John Kirton, you met last night from the University of Toronto. James Manicom is just completing his 2nd year as a SSHRC, that's the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada postdoctoral fellow here at the Balsillie School, and works primarily in East Asia politics and security. And Julia Kulik, who will serve as a discussant, is a graduate student at the University of Toronto and has worked extensively with John Kirton on G8, G20 issues. So with that, let me invite Akira.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank the Japan Futures Initiative for giving me this wonderful opportunity to present at this symposium along such distinguished guests. My name is Akira Igata from Keio University. Today, my presentation will focus on a project that I was fortunate enough to be involved in for the last 6 months in Japan regarding the Fukushima nuclear accident. As can be seen in my long title, I engaged in research conducting interviews and helped draft a report of the Independent Investigation Commission on the Fukushima Daiichi Nuclear Accident as a working group member of this commission. So this is a picture of the 400-page report that our Independent Investigation Committee made, which I brought the actual book here. And it's a comprehensive report on the accident at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. In order to think about the issue of Japan's energy security after 3/11, I believe it is necessary for us to understand exactly what happened at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, and to be able to assess the various responses that were taken after the accident. As such, it is my hope that my presentation on this report today will help us in thinking about the future of Japan's energy security as the session goes on. Before I get into my presentation, I would like to state a quick disclaimer that the opinions expressed in this presentation is that of my own, and they are not attributable to the Independent Investigation Committee, Keio University, or any other institutions that I'm affiliated with. This report was released just 2 weeks ago in Japan on February 28th, and it is currently being translated into English. Although this report is a private initiative conducted by a newly built think tank called Rebuild Japan Initiative Foundation with no authority behind it whatsoever, the report has attracted considerable media attention. As you can see here, it has been reported by all of the major Japanese newspapers, Asahi, Sankei, Mainichi, Yomiuri, Nikkei, and so on, and several TV stations such as NHK, TV Asahi, and TBS have reported on primetime programs focusing on this report. It has also been reported in the mainstream media all around the world, such as the New York Times, Le Monde, and Al Jazeera. And for this presentation, I've also checked some Canadian newspapers to see if they had some articles, and I was able to find articles in Globe and Mail, National Post, and the Vancouver Sun. So just 3 days after its release, the report hit #1 on the best-selling book on Amazon. And it actually beat comic books and weight loss instruction books, which I think is a considerable feat for a 400-page investigation report. So why did this private report receive so much attention? In Japan, there are 3 other major investigation committees that are conducting an investigation into why the accident in Fukushima happened and assessing the response of the Prime Minister's office, various government agencies, and TEPCO, which is the Tokyo Electric Company. However, TEPCO's investigation is not seen as a credible entity to engage in an investigation, since the TEPCO is the owner of Fukushima Daiichi and the one responsible for the on-site management of the accident. I must also mention that despite our commission's repeated request for an interview, TEPCO did not accept our interview request until the end, so I believe they have further lost their credibility with the public for this reason. In addition, the two other investigation committees, which is seen at the center and at the bottom, are seen with a wary eye by the public, especially since the government has been facing heavy criticisms for not disclosing certain information to the public during the Fukushima Daiichi crisis, which I will touch upon later. In contrast, our investigation commission is an initiative independent from the government or the electric company. The fact that the chairman, program director, and the member of our expert panel are all famous public intellectuals must have been an important factor as well. It was also the first and the only commission that was able to produce a finalized report by the one-year anniversary of 3/11. So I think all of these factors played part in the major coverage of the report and its subsequent high interest among the public. So what was the process of drafting this report? There's a 6-member expert committee, which can be seen on the right top corner. And they are the official joint author of this report. And under the instruction and supervision of this expert committee, the report was drafted by 24 working group members seen on the left side here, which consists of university professors, researchers, lawyers, and journalists. All of the working group members had different areas of specialty in various subjects, such as nuclear power engineering, philosophy of science and technology, sociology, political science, local administration, crisis management, disaster prevention, and the list goes on. I myself am trained as a political science and major in international politics. Furthermore, the age of the working group members varied from mid-20s in their youngest to early 50s in their oldest. So we really had a good mix of different careers, expertise, and age group, and were able to bring together various perspectives for our investigation. Another notable aspect of this report is that it was written after extensive interview with over 300 people related to the government, such as bureaucrats, the head of local governments, personnel from the SDF, the police, the fire department, hospital, and other experts in the field. Among others, we were able to conduct in-depth 2 to 3 hour interviews with each of the top government officials who were in charge of managing the accident at Fukushima. So those interviewed by the working group includes former Prime Minister Naoto Kan, as seen in the center, Banri Kaeda, left bottom, who was the Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry, which is the ministry that houses Nuclear and Industry Safety Agency, the agency responsible for ensuring the safety of nuclear facilities. You can also see Yukio Edano at the top center there, who, if you are Japanese, must now be a very familiar figure, since he was responsible for relaying the information regarding the nuclear power plant to the public during the early days of the accident. And you can see other key figures such as Haruki Madarame, Hosono, Goshi Hosono, and so on. Now, since the report is over 400 pages, I will go over 4 parts of the report very briefly. Then I will focus on 3 topics, actually 2 topics, which I consider as a major contribution of this report to the public debate on how Japan should secure its energy needs in the post-3/11 environment. The prologue of the report starts with a message from the chairman and director of the commission, followed by an essay written by a TEPCO engineer who was working at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant when the earthquake actually struck. His vivid description of the experience is a valuable source of information that in and of itself is worth reading, in my opinion. Part 1 of the report is a chronological overview of the accident, focusing on the immediate on-site responses and the effects of the released radioactive materials to the water, food, rubble of the wreckage, and as well as the explanation of the effects of low-level radiation to the public. Part 2 looks at how various actors responded to the accident, such as the decision made by the Office of the Prime Minister, on-site responses by the SDF, fire department, and the police to cool the reactors, the monitoring of radioactive materials by the local governments, and evacuation from hospitals. Numerous other important topics are dealt with in this section as well, such as the decision-making process of the multiple, yet gradual enlargement of the evacuation orders by the government, the use, or rather the non-use, of radiation prediction system called SPEEDY in setting the evacuation perimeters, and the reasons for the malfunction of the off-site center, which was supposed to play a central role in a nuclear accident response, yet failed to do so for various reasons in the case of Fukushima. Another one of the characteristics of this report is that it does not simply look at the short-term or immediate causes of the accident, but analyzes the medium to long-term aspects of the accident as well. Part 3 looks at the historical, cultural, and institutional factors that contributed to the lack of preparedness against nuclear accident. One example of which would be the myth of absolute safety that permeated throughout the Japanese society preceding the Fukushima accident. I will touch upon this later. Part 4 explained the international aspect of the accident, such as the implications to nuclear security, implications to international nuclear safety regime, and analysis of Japan-US coordination during the initial stage of the crisis, which I won't go into detail here, since I'm sure we'll hear more about this during the second session of this symposium from Professor Yoshitomi, who is from the National Defense Academy. So even from this very brief overview, it should now be apparent that this is a comprehensive report that really covers a wide range of factors related to the accident of Fukushima. And reading through these chapters would hopefully help the public in forming their opinions on how Japan should supply its future energy needs. Although there are a number of important points that I think deserve discussion in this report, I will introduce just 2 here to illustrate some of our findings that pertains to the decision-making of Japan's future energy security. First is the uncovering of a worst-case scenario, which was created by the government, but was not released to the public at the time. On March 22nd, the government ordered the creation of what would happen if everything went wrong under the worst circumstances. This scenario led to a demonic chain reaction of meltdowns that would necessitate the evacuation of up to 250-kilometer radius of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plants. So I made a little map here. So this is what a 250-kilometer evacuation zone looks like. Now, as you can see here, it includes the metropolitan area of Tokyo, as well as other major cities with large populations such as Sendai and Saitama. So in total, the evacuation of 30 million residents would have been necessary had this worst-case scenario materialized. In thinking about the future of Japan's energy security, knowing that worst-case scenario of the Fukushima accident would likely affect the calculation of acceptable risk among the Japanese public, as well as outside experts. The second contribution is in identifying the historical and its institutional factors, which could perhaps be called as a permissive cause of the Fukushima accident. One of the main factors that the interim report of the government highlights is the human error. It basically argues that in Unit 1 of the Fukushima Daiichi, the workers at the plant misunderstood the state of isolation condenser. And at Unit 3, the workers there mishandled the high-pressure cooler injections, both of which accelerated the meltdown. Now, although these were genuine mistakes, our independent investigation committee report argues that we must not simply look at these immediate causes of human errors, but look deeper into the historical and institutional background which allowed such accidents to happen. For instance, why did the workers make a mistake? Were they trained for similar crises? What rendered them to operate in a dismal environment where plant parameters became unreliable and led to the increased confusion of the workers' operational environment? Our report suggests several historical and institutional factors, 2 of which I will introduce here. First important historical background is the myth of absolute safety. Because of the strong anti-nuclear sentiment in some of the local areas where the nuclear power plants were operating, the myth that nuclear powers were absolutely safe has been created. In order to keep this myth alive, nuclear power plant owners shied away from introducing new measures that would have increased the safety of the plant had something gone awry. After all, why was there a need to introduce new technology if nuclear power plants were 100% safe? The second institutional background is the state-planned, private-operated nature of nuclear power plants. In Japan, the government had been driving forwards the use of nuclear power, yet the actual operation of the plant was done by private companies. Therefore, as time passed, the responsibility for ensuring the safety of nuclear power plants were delegated to the private companies, which rendered the responsibilities of the government to secure safety at nuclear power plants ambiguous. So, considering this case is also important in thinking about the future of Japan's energy security and how to supply its electricity needs in the future. If the current safety measures are not up to date because of the myth of absolute safety, and the institutional structure is problematic, then there is a need to take into account of the costs of rectifying the various problems that stems from the institutional problems that we now know into the equation. So to conclude, currently, out of the 54 nuclear reactors in Japan, only 2 are currently in operation, and one in Kashiwazaki-Kariwa, which is in Niigata Prefecture, is scheduled to stop for regular checkup on March 26. The last plant to stop will be the Tomari nuclear power plant in Hokkaido, which is scheduled for a checkup in early May. And although it was reported yesterday that the current Noda administration will seek to restart Oi nuclear power plant, which is in Fukui Prefecture, it will likely face a strong opposition from the local communities. And according to the report today, there are opposition within the DPJ as well. So whether and how soon it will restart is an open question. However, there is an inevitable truth that the energy shortage will be severe once the summer season hits this year, since unlike last year, where 19 nuclear power plants were still in operation, there will likely be none operating this summer unless they are restarted. The report does not give an assessment on whether Japan should or should not continue using nuclear energy. In other words, the report takes no stance with regard to the question of how Japan should secure its energy security in the future. However, analysis of what happened in Fukushima and how the government and other related agencies responded to the crisis, in addition to the explanation of and unique historical and institutional aspects of Japanese nuclear energy in the past, constitutes, I believe, as a necessary first step in assessing the risks and costs entailed in continuing to rely on nuclear power to meet its future energy needs. As such, I truly hope that this report will become an important reference to both the public and the experts for enriching the ongoing debate in Japan about how to secure Japan's energy in the post-3/11 world. Thank you very much.
Thank you both for the very interesting presentation and for doing it within the time frame. It's much appreciated. John, why don't you come up here?
Thank you very much. My remarks are entitled Energy Security Amidst Disaster, the Global Governance Response to March 11th. So we'll turn from the immediate impact in Japan to the broader consequences for us all as a prelude to the further speakers who will focus yet again on Japan and the immediate neighbors and then on Canada itself in Julia's case. I think it's a fundamentally important topic. When David DeWitt and I wrote our first book, which was published in 1983, we chose as one of our critical case studies energy security. And obviously, very much on our minds was the second oil shock out of Iran in 1979. So beginning with energy security at the center, we've long been aware that on the demand side for global governance, energy security is importantly affected by shocks. I think shocks of 3 kinds. The first, of course, the oil shocks, 73, 79, and then the smaller ones out of Iraq, the Gulf War in 1991, and of course the one out of Iran this year, right now, one might say. Second set of shocks are civilian nuclear energy accidents. And here there is a history. 3 Mile Island, also in 79. That was a season of multiple shocks. Of course, Chernobyl, the biggie, 1986. Then one that regrettably we seem not to have noticed or remembered too much here in North America, Toikumura in Japan, September 1999. But my colleague, Michael Donnelly, has written eloquently about that. And then, of course, Fukushima. One thing I should note is if you look at this set of shocks and focus on the real material world, the body count, Chernobyl was the biggie. We also had fatalities out of Toikumura. We didn't at 3 Mile Island, and I guess we're still watching on Toikumura. But nonetheless, 3 Mile Island, just a little bit south of where we are now, eliminated the commissioning, the planning, the production of nuclear power plants in the United States for about 3 decades. Only now are they starting to move through, let me call it the memory. So even if no one dies, you can have profound, enduring, long-range energy security effects. Third set of shocks, of course, are natural disasters. A long history. We remember the Indonesian Indian Ocean tsunami, December 2004. Closer to home, Hurricane Katrina, which took out New Orleans, August 2005, and hammered the whole Gulf Coast. Natural disasters, as soon as they hit, wipe out the energy infrastructure right away, even if there isn't a nuclear power plant anywhere close, so immediate implications for energy security. What was unprecedented about Fukushima is that it was a classic energy shock, oil and infrastructure, a natural disaster, a nuclear accident, all combined into one. Same place, largely the same time. So hit Japan especially hard, ground zero. But of course hit many other countries directly. G7 countries with citizens in the area, amongst the 20,000 killed or missing. And an immediate effect on global energy security writ large, which is why I think it's important to ask what was the global governance response. And here, I think we need to look in 4 categories. The first is unilateral response. And a lot of the consequential countries in the world were there within hours and days. And the last chapter appropriately singles out the exceptionality of the United States in your report, because of course the United States had lots of material assets right at or very close to ground zero, station forces in Japan, but many other countries too. And they did a terrific job of immediate disaster relief, and I think did much, despite the ongoing questions about station forces in Okinawa, much to restore the image of the United States military and the United States amongst the Japanese public. The multilateral system of the United Nations galaxy is next that we look at. When we think of global governance, that's what an entire generation thinks of in the first instance. And here let me suggest that the multilateral system largely failed. Didn't fail in the very specific, immediate, single subject of disaster relief in the event of a nuclear accident. The International Atomic Energy Agency did that quite well. But in the face of this unprecedented triple shock, triple disaster, you needed more than just the short-term single subject concern with a one nuclear accident. In that broader sense, the United Nations system failed. The G20, worth looking at as a summit-centered system that does, if not everything, does much, including energy, including finance. And it, too, I think, was inadequate to the challenge. So finally, the good old G8, much longer. And there, I think, the response by the somewhat larger standards, longer, broader, what the disaster demands, that's why we're here today, The G8 did rather well, and from that record, I'd like to end with a few thoughts about how we might innovate in international governance as we look ahead. First, the multilateral organizational system. And here I think the story in short form suggests a predictable pattern. Immediately on day one, March 11, the International Atomic Energy was there with its built-in standard operating procedure from its built-in unit, the Incident and Emergency Response Center. It took a few days before the Japanese government, the authorities, actually connected with the Atomic Energy Agency. Vienna was offering, but Japan was not asking until about March 14th. But very quickly after Japan understood it needed help from abroad and went to the IAEA, its requests were of a specific sort. It asked for help in environmental monitoring, and it also asked for help in human health, as your report mentioned. The organization it asked for help from, of course, has as its mission atomic energy. That's the A&E. Where was the United Nations Multilateral Organization for the Environment or for Human Health? In the case of the environment, there's no there unless UNEP is your one of choice. In health, it's the World Health Organization. How were they as first responder is the obvious question that emerges. A little later, March 25th, that's about 2 weeks later, it was food contamination. That was the big problem for Japan. And then the International Atomic Energy did combine with the Food and Agricultural Organization out of Rome to provide a response. But it was only then 2 weeks later that the Secretary General of the United Nations got involved in any visible way by getting in touch with the heads of a few of the specialized agencies to provide a more comprehensive, integrated response. And if you go through to the end of the month, at the national level, Japan was dealing with the issue, yes, from the Cabinet Office, but with an interministerial committee that involved not just health and agriculture, but foreign affairs, labor and welfare ministers, showing, I think, that inherently you have a multi-subject problem demanding at the national level a multi-institutional response coordinated from the top as a disaster of different sorts very quickly rolled out. But at the United Nations galaxy level of global governance, the response in that comprehensive, top-level coordinated way was very slow, very selective. The obvious question is, looking for innovation in global governance, how can we do better the next time? Even if the next time is not as big as the worst case disaster, but even as small, may I say, as 3 Mile Island a long time ago. The G20, what was its response? It was an interesting one. First out of the gate, a few days later, was the German environment minister. He said, this is terrible. We really need to do a much better job of higher nuclear safety standards across Europe as a whole. Then the French weighed in. That was saying, oh, yes, we must check our nuclear plants as we're doing now, and yes, things are looking pretty good. The adequate regime is, not bad. Nothing much more needed. I don't know if I'd leap to that phrase, a culture of denial. And then a little later, President Sarkozy, who was, of course, hosting the G20 that year, says, well, Mr. Sarkozy is always very energetic. I will call within a matter of weeks a special meeting of G20 energy ministers and economic ministers to try and provide better global governance for this unprecedented disaster. That meeting never happened. There was some talk, well, the G20 is meeting for some little study seminar in Nanking a little later. Why don't we wait and talk about it there? But the G20, despite some of these early forays, just was unable to, I think, react in any meaningful way, despite the fact that just before January 12th, 2010, natural disaster in Haiti, and of course, the G20 was there with an instant response. What about the G8? The G8 was, one might say fortuitously, having a pre-scheduled meeting of its foreign ministers on March 14th in Paris, half a world away. Fortuitously, what a lucky coincidence, but no, that is an outcropping of a particular fact, the intensity or institutional density of a system, a governance system. So immediately, the foreign ministers meeting, which was supposed to be focused on doing the responsibility to protect in Libya, we were just a few weeks before, actually, the fighters were in the air over Benghazi out of G7 countries. Also worrying about the nuclear weapons program in Iran with all the implications for conventional security. But it instantly reconfigured, put Fukushima on the agenda and in the #1 spot, right? Started with Fukushima and then went on to consider one place, one time, same group of people. Foreign ministers are pretty good at that. All of the broader implications. And then just a few days later, G7 finance ministers were there. Perversely, when Fukushima hit, the Japanese yen was soaring to an historic high, bizarrely given the economic fundamentals. The US dollar was dropping to a historic post-World War II low against the yen. That's an important component of GDP. So if you ask which country is in decline, well, it's a different readout than the one we often think of is in Japan. But faced with the mania rather than the magic of the marketplace, the G7 finance ministers and the central bankers engaged in their first coordinated exchange rate intervention in a decade to help protect, to bring the yen down and protect Japan's immediately hammered export-oriented economy recover. And then if we look outwards to the actual Deauville summit of the G8 a few months later, one can see this integrated, comprehensive, leader-directed approach to Fukushima, I think, being there in its multidimensional and prospectively effective way. What lessons do I draw from this story about what innovations in global governance might be appropriate to think of? Given the unprecedented nature of the disaster and the sheer material body count, it's a rather long list, but let me identify a few. The first is if you just think of the pillars of the United Nations system, there's some missing ones. I do think we need a World Energy Organization that governs oil and gas, as well as nuclear energy, as well as all the new renewables. Rather remarkable that after all the oil shocks, yes, we still have OPEC. Yes, we've got the International Energy Agency in Paris, which Henry Kissinger invented in April of 1974 in Detroit. But we don't have a global organization yet. but we know our energy security problems are integrated across the multiple sources. We might even consider the utility of creating a real-world environmental organization comparable to the World Health Organization or the World Food Organization. The Food and Agricultural Organization, although actually we have 3 multilateral organizations governing food, all headquartered in Rome. And then, of course, in 2005, there was the Hyogo framework for natural disaster assistance. Maybe it deserves a real multilateral organization of its own with a leader and executive head to actually talk within hours of the first news release with the head of the WHO and so on down the line. We do probably can see the benefits of having a whole of the UN galaxy-wide response system. Why did it take the Secretary General of the UN 2 weeks before he picked up the phone to the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency so they could collectively consider the multiple dimensions of this crisis and offer on behalf of the multilateral system a more coherent and comprehensive response? So I think at the multilateral level, where I see the global governance gaps as being most profound, there is a to-do list of what we might consider. And although many people begin by saying, oh, inventing new multilateral organization, it's a non-starter in today's world, that's simply not empirically correct. In the 1990s, we created the World Trade Organization. We created the International Criminal Court. And of course, countries such as Japan and Canada had a consequential role in bringing about these things. We can do it. We have in the recent past. One final point, because David has been very generous with the time. We turn to the G20. One of the great successes of a G20 governance was at the Pittsburgh Summit, where the 20 leaders agreed within the medium term to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Had they implemented that commitment, they would have produced a quadruple win. That's what leaders at their best do. If you eliminate fossil fuel subsidies from the countries of the world, you save the hard-pressed taxpayers and cash-short finance ministries in an age of austerity over $500 billion. It's a figure from the International Energy Agency and others. It's a well-scrubbed figure. You also, if you're worried about climate change, cut by 1/10, it's a big slice, emissions, carbon emissions into the atmosphere. You do a lot for human health of mothers and babies who die unnecessarily over primitive wood cooking stoves where the fuel is dung, subsidized peat, subsidized wood, and other bad things. And of course, because subsidies breed corruption, if you're interested in that kind of good governance, if you could just do this one thing, which the G20 already agreed to, you would have those gains. But of course, gains for energy security as well, right? You subsidize it, energy is overused, right? And it's fossil fuels, it's not nuclear. So for Japan and other countries that may want to go from nuclear, you did have the G20 unknowingly coming up with a solution, a big, bold, innovative decision. Hasn't been implemented, right? So how do we get global governance, the G20, to comply with even the very good things to do? There's others on the short list, but I think that's enough to provoke discussion for now. Thank you, David.
Thanks, John. James, the floor is yours. Please come on up here.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking David Welch and all the organizers and the funding agencies for making this possible and for inviting me. I approach these questions from my work on East Asia security and in that context, energy security. So I'm going to devote my 20 minutes to exploring the implications for the 3/11 disaster for Japanese energy policy and Japanese energy security. And those aren't necessarily the same thing, and I'll I'll touch on that in a bit. I'll start by telling you a little bit about how the Japanese government historically has thought about energy and why energy security works, I think, as a paradigm through which to explore these questions. Then I'll talk a bit about nuclear power and locate it within Japan's energy mix and its electricity mix. And then I'll touch on whether or not it's possible for Japan to move beyond nuclear power. I'm not going to get into specifics as to what that might look like because I have to admit that I don't know. I'm not sure if anyone knows, so I'm not going to get into that level of detail. And I'll conclude with the implications for Japan's energy strategy, and I'll touch very briefly on where Canada fits in, because I know Julia is going to get to that in a bit more detail. My answer ahead of time is I'm pessimistic that Japan can move away from nuclear power without dramatically changing some level of its comfort, of its economy. It'll have to incur costs to do so, costs on GDP growth, costs on sweating at work, call it what you want, but there'll be, the life in Japan will change without nuclear power. So to talk about nuclear power and energy in the Japanese mindset, this is not just an economic question for Japan. It never has been. As you are all aware, Japan does feel an acute sense of insecurity about certain things, soybeans, for instance, and energy, right, after the experiences they had in the 1970s. So there is a sense in Japan that energy is something that needs to be secured. The UN Development Program defines energy security, just so we're all on the same page, as the availability of energy at all times, in various forms, in sufficient quantities, and at affordable prices, without unacceptable or irreversible impact on the economy and the environment. Daniel Yergin and those of us who are energy realists just call it getting enough energy at affordable prices. That's energy security for an energy realist, if you like. Economists would argue, of course, that the very idea of energy security shouldn't exist, right? That energy markets do function. If country A, wants to overpay to improve a diplomatic stance with country B to produce oil, that improves everybody's energy security because more oil is in the market, so the price goes down, right? So an economist would argue that the idea of securing energy actually pollutes what is otherwise a well-functioning market. I don't think it's correct or accurate to suggest the history of the oil market is one that's always worked without the intervention of politics. Of course, we can all think of examples of politics polluting the oil market, right? It is imperfect, and it is interfered with by national oil companies, states, international government organizations, and of course, independent oil companies themselves, right? Primarily because of a perceived sense of scarcity or the perception that controlling oil at its source somehow provides you with security when you feel insecure about getting your oil. In Japan, the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy, which is located within METI, is quite candid about its perceived sources of energy insecurity. It lists these as political conditions in the Middle East, so the Arab Spring, if you like, incidental threats to terrorism or natural disasters, so things like the 3/11 disaster, reduction of investments or market manipulation by supply nations, so a repeat of the oil crises of the 1970s, and demand trends in importing nations like China and India. Remember in 2004 when the oil price went up to the unsustainable level of $40 a barrel, everyone blamed consumption increasing demand in China and India, right? And that was sort of the context in which that was made. And the mismanagement of the domestic energy industry, which I'll touch on very briefly. So Japan's energy security strategy is designed to mitigate these threats, if you like, and it uses basically 4 approaches, which are standard, I think, across most importing nations. The first is diversification of energy source, right? So you're going to move away from resources that you import from the Middle East, like oil, and try to consume things like natural gas and nuclear power and coal, right? Second, diversification of energy import source. So instead of importing all your oil from the Middle East, import your oil from Australia, from China, from Indonesia, right? Likewise, natural gas. Diversify so that you're protected against political disruptions in the parts of the world that produce oil. Japan hasn't been very successful at that. It's still very reliant on Middle East oil. The third is improving energy security through industrial adjustment, right? And Japan has been very good at that. After the oil crises, Japan basically, redid its electricity grid to move away from things like oil to things like nuclear power over the course of the 70s and 1980s, right? As well as natural gas and coal. And the result is Japan now burns very little oil, fuel oil for electricity, right? That's not like other countries. China in particular still burns fuel oil for electricity. The fourth strategy is the rationalization of the domestic energy industry, right? This means you have to ensure that electricity is delivered efficiently. In Japan, this meant the creation of local regional monopolies that controlled not only electricity generation, but also its transmission and distribution infrastructure. That's worked within those regions. But the idea here was that you'd allow these companies enough spare capacity to handle spikes in demand. There's some negative side effects to that, which I'll touch on in a little bit, but the idea was that if you had a well-functioning electricity market, that would also make electricity cheaper. Of course, electricity in Japan has always been relatively expensive. To turn to the role of nuclear power in Japan's energy mix, nuclear power is promoted as a direct outgrowth of the 1970s oil crises, right? This is about improving energy security by reducing consumption of fossil fuels, moving away from Middle Eastern oil, and had the benefit, if you like, of reducing carbon emissions. What they did was they were able to isolate oil consumption predominantly to the transportation sector and use nuclear power and hydroelectricity to make up the difference in what they weren't burning in oil for the electricity. So Japan's electricity generation, the mix of where they got their electricity pre-311 is as follows. 63% of their electricity came from conventional thermal sources, so that's coal, oil, and natural gas. 27 to 29%, the number sort of varies, from nuclear sources. 8% from hydroelectric, and 2% from renewable, right? And we'll get back to those numbers in a little bit. The nuclear industry was, of course, as you're probably all aware, and I think as Akira touched on, driven by a number of government subsidies to local governments and cities to host the facilities. It was driven by a public relations campaign, which Akira touched on as well, to cure, in words of one analyst, to cure the Japanese of their nuclear allergy, right? Japan, for obvious reasons relating to the end of World War II, it had a nuclear allergy, and this was a public relations campaign designed to sell nuclear power to local communities and to make it worth their while to host these things. The emergence of nuclear energy could be interpreted as all that is positive and negative with the Japanese way of making domestic policy. This is the context in which post-311 energy policy is being made. 2 of Japan's 54 reactors are on use. Operating capacity sits at about 6%. All will be shut down by 2012 unless, of course, this one is restarted. Restarting reactors, though, does require, as far as I understand it, local government consent, and local governments are, of course, sensitive to local public opinion. Local public opinion is anti-nuclear. There's talk of whether the Prime Minister can override that. I don't know what that looks like. That would certainly be an interesting political game when that does finally occur. Prior to the 311 disaster, nuclear power was scheduled to grow under Japan's future energy strategy from 27% of electricity to between 40 and 50 by 2030. Right? These plans are, for all intents and purposes, shelved, and the debate now seems to be whether or not Japan will keep its existing nuclear power capacity, whether it will eliminate it completely, or arrive at some kind of middle ground. Nuclear power, as I mentioned, is now, of course, very unpopular in Japan, as you're all aware. In addition to the sort of standard concerns that come out of an anti-nuclear group, 311 gives anti-nuclear lobbies something they can point to and say, look, this proves us right. This is everything that is wrong with nuclear power. And this is catching on in Japan, as I understand it. There's a scholar working on this stuff, and he's pointing out that there are now mass protests of well over 40,000 people protesting against the resumption of nuclear reactors and of protesting in favor of getting rid of nuclear power completely. Those protests of those size are not a normal part of the Japanese political landscape, right? Historically speaking, to get 40,000 Japanese people to come and protest, that's a big deal. So I think that sort of speaks to the tone of where this debate is going in Japan. Part of course, where this comes from is, of course, the accusations of corruption and incompetence on the part of TEPCO, not just after the disaster itself, but of course in the decades leading up to that, right? This is not totally unfounded. TEPCO did try to cover up a number of safety concerns in some of its reactors in the past. In 2002, there were revelations of over 30 serious incidences over the course of the 1980s that were covered up by TEPCO management. And these revelations led to the shutdown of 17 reactors in 2002. Like other industries in Japan, there is a somewhat incestuous relationship between industry regulators, so in METI, the private sector, and the government, many of whom sort of move from one area to another over the course of their careers. TEPCO, of course, was also a leading donor to the LDP for much of the 1980s and much of the 1990s. I don't know what the relationship is like with the DPJ. So in the wake of 311, obviously, TEPCO, the utility, political elites, and the ANRE itself within METI have all been accused of corruption, collusion, and/or incompetence following the disaster as a function of the Fukushima disaster. And this all affects public opinion and the view it takes on the direction of Japan's energy policy and the role of nuclear power in that energy policy. There has been, as I understand it, some movement on the government side post-3/11. There is, I think, a regulatory reform move to move nuclear safety out of METI so that METI is not simultaneously trying to push for the expansion of the industry while also trying to regulate its safety. The new safety agency will be taken over by Ministry of Education people, and it's staffed by them rather than by METI. So that is obviously a sign that the government is aware that there are regulatory problems. Turning to what this means for Japan's energy security going forward, the increase from 27% to 50% of electricity, that was based on the construction of 14 new reactors. Those are to be scrapped, as far as I know. This means Japan will have to make up the shortfall. So if you're going to grow from 25, say, to 50% of the electricity mix by 2030, that means you've got to come up with a difference of 25% just if you keep nuclear power, right? If you replace nuclear power completely, you've got to come up with half of what you're going to, half again of what you're going to fall in terms of generating capacity. Current installed nuclear power capacity is 49 gigawatts, and they produce 266 billion kilowatt hours, 266 billion kilowatt hours of electricity in 2009. So if you eliminate that, depending on how demand trends go in Japan, you have to replace at least that, plus perhaps as much, half again as much. This is a tall order in the absence of nuclear power. A new energy strategy has been promised. It will obviously have to be revolutionary in order to meet what I think the public is expecting. Prime Minister Noda has already suggested that renewables will fill this gap, growing to 20% of electricity generation by 2020. Pre-3/11 energy security plans had it growing to 20% by 2030. So that's actually an acceleration of existing plans. But that also assumed a maximum, what the energy strategy calls a maximum introduction of relevant technologies. And of course, renewables are a very popular choice, right? Particularly in the context of rising anti-nuclear opinion, right? Very few anti-nuclear advocates then say you should replace nuclear with coal, right? Most anti-nuclear advocates typically suggest replacing nuclear with renewables. And so they are popular. And there have been some plans outlined by private firms to build solar facilities. Right, there's parts of the country where you can find a pretty concerted effort to put solar panels on rooftops and to increase the output of wind farms. There are a couple of barriers to growth of renewables that I just want to touch on with some of the time I have. My understanding is that prospective wind farm sites are far from where they need to be, so they're not off the coast of high-use areas. Any kind of construction of new infrastructure, any kind of introduction of renewables means you have to construct new infrastructure to transmit that electricity around Japan. Transmitting electricity between the regional sub-monopolies of electricity companies is very difficult in Japan. The infrastructure just isn't there. And of course, as we were talking about at breakfast, there is a frequency difference between East and West Japan. One operates at 50 megahertz, one operates at 60. It's obviously a problem. There's also, of course, the issue of typhoons relating to wind farms, right? If you locate a large portion of your energy generation offshore, you're going to have problems not unlike Hurricane Katrina created when it came through the Gulf of Mexico and wiped out most of the refining capacity for U.S. oil, as well as disrupted a lot of the electricity generation in that area. Investment in renewables will be resisted, I suspect, by local electricity generating, the local power companies. These companies have already invested very heavily in nuclear, in LNG, liquefied natural gas, and in coal. They already control 85% of the electricity generation in Japan, and will likely lobby against the adoption of renewables for a couple of reasons. One is they don't have, adopting renewables means you have to invest in storage facilities for energy, because of course renewables are intermittent. But they'll also resist, because of their regional monopolies, they can't expand. So they will resist the introduction of new actors within their geographical area that can sell electricity consumers as a competition, right? They will resist that. And it's also apparently, they're having a very difficult time selling surplus electricity in Japan already. So there's a couple of sort of path dependencies, if you like, as to the way that the country is structured that militate against the adoption of renewables. Could these monopolies invest in renewables themselves? Yes, they could, right? And that would, of course, not mean the introduction of new actors selling competing electricity in their own region. But as I said, these companies have already invested very heavily in nuclear. They're amongst some of the leading, most specialized nuclear power experts in the world. And so, of course, they're not going to want, at least as far as I can tell, invest in renewables without substantial government support, right? Which, of course, increases the cost of transferring from nuclear to renewables. So it's not that renewables are impossible. It's just that chasing renewables to the extent of 20% of your electricity mix by 2020 means that you really have to go against a lot of the existing way electricity generation is constructed and distributed in Japan, right? So it's just a barrier. Geothermal has been advanced as a possible alternative source because you all know there's a number of hot springs in Japan. Of course, most of them are located in national parks for obvious reasons. And of course, the idea of digging into a hot spring to extract heat is somewhat antithetical to the sort of the cultural places I understand it, the hot springs have in Japan. And so geothermal actually came about the same time nuclear did in Japan in the 60s, but was resisted far more stridently than was nuclear at the time by environmentalist groups and by tourist organizations. At the end of the day, geothermal just doesn't generate enough electricity. You'd have to build about 20 geothermal plants in order to equal one nuclear power plant. So if you go geothermal, then one is going to have a geothermal plant every 6 or 10 kilometers in Japan, all over the country. And again, there are integration issues, plugging those plants into the grid. So far, in the post-311 year, nuclear power has been replaced by fossil fuels. Oil and coal consumption were both supposed to decline under pre-11 energy strategies. As part of Japan's Kyoto commitments, as part of energy security, coal is dirty and oil comes from the Middle East. But continued fossil fuel imports have been the easiest solution and arguably the cheapest based on the cost of current natural gas and coal versus subsidizing renewables and trying to sort of break down and rebuild Japan's domestic electricity construction. Current estimates suggest that fuel imports will increase by 8% a year, that's 350,000 barrels per day, and LNG imports will increase by 13% a year. That's not insignificant, and that will obviously have impact on the price. There's basically three impacts that I can see that relate to energy, to Japan's economy as a whole, and then I'll touch on one of the main ones for energy security. The three impacts of a greater reliance on fossil fuels are with increased consumption comes higher prices, and natural gas in Asia is not like natural gas in North America. It's not cheap, it's expensive. There's what people call an Asian premium on LNG. Japan's well placed to expand its LNG consumption because it does have a surplus capacity of deliquefiers, natural gas gasifications that can offload liquid natural gas and burn it as gas. They have a surplus capacity of that. So spot prices for LNG have increased 30% compared to pre-311 levels. So the Japanese people are paying more for electricity. This obviously has an economic consequence. The Nikkei Daily did a survey earlier this year that found that a number of corporations would move their operations offshore to countries that burn cheaper sources of electricity. No one's saying China, but they mean China, which burns coal and will continue to burn coal. And of course, leaving aside the cost of electricity, there's also the issue of stability. So that does not bode well for domestic Japanese manufacturing, if you like, rising energy costs. Secondly, the rise of imports of LNG and of coal and of oil have negatively affected the balance of trade. Credit Suisse estimated that basically half of as we all know, Japan's running a trade deficit now. Half of that value apparently comes from the increase in the import value from higher energy prices. And finally, of course, relying on fossil fuels increases Japan's energy footprint. Its carbon footprint, right? Japan, I suppose, could walk away from its Kyoto obligations as higher energy costs dictate. But Japan, I think, more than any country, has invested a great deal in the success of the Kyoto Protocol. So that's obviously a political decision that has to be made down the road. Finally, from an energy security standpoint, burning more fossil fuels to replace nuclear power exposes Japan to the vagaries of the international oil market and what some people call the international energy game. I don't like calling it a game, but people have talked about great games in Africa, in Central Asia. Japan, I would argue, and some of my work does try to play this game in as much as it uses the instruments of statecraft, resource diplomacy, if you like, to access energy sources overseas. It doesn't do this with the same excitement that does China. It doesn't use to commit as many resources financially as does China. Also, it doesn't offer UN Security Council cover as does China to some of the countries that it's trying to compete with to produce oil. Japan isn't very well placed to play that oil game well for a couple of reasons. One of them is this fact that it seems unwilling to spend the money required to compete with China when it comes down to getting a bidding war with Venezuela, for instance, for access to oil. But also, that kind of resource diplomacy doesn't mitigate Japanese concerns, right? Japan's concerned about price, and resource diplomacy, almost by definition, means you're overpaying for the oil you're getting or the natural gas you're getting. The Chinese are prepared to do that because they're worried about security of supply. They're worried about oil coming to them on non-Chinese flagships through the Straits of Malacca that have been blocked by the Americans for some foreign policy question. Japan's not worried about that. Japan is worried about price, and so resource diplomacy doesn't really help you get cheaper resources. Also, I would argue that Japan is burdened somewhat by being a U.S. ally. The cost of being a good U.S. ally means bad relations with Iran, and that has cost Japan in the past a couple of resource investments in Iran. And what doesn't help the perception of energy insecurity in Japan is that whenever Japan reduces investments in Iran, China comes in to fill the void. But that said, Japan has broken from Western Middle East diplomacy in the past in order to negotiate direct access with Middle Eastern governments. It did so after the oil crisis, so perhaps it might do so again. But again, that's a policy question that it will occur, I suppose, be made down the road. Let me just conclude here with a couple of points. The situation, at least from an energy security standpoint, is still very fluid. It's very hard to say which direction public opinion is going in terms of what people are prepared to tolerate. It's no doubt that people are anti-nuclear. But how anti-nuclear? What lifestyle are the Japanese people prepared to accept to not have nuclear power? Not having nuclear power means cool biz all the time, right? At minimum in Japan, right? It is a dramatically different lifestyle depending on how Japanese electricity consumption increases. So, even though public opinion is anti-nuclear, over time we might consider that keeping some nuclear power plants open is feasible in as much as public opinion tolerates it as a necessary condition of Japan maintaining a functioning economy, coupled with recommendations coming out that change the way nuclear power is run, is regulated in Japan, and perhaps over time perceived. Japan is industry. Of course, public opinion also might not matter. I mean, industry consumes a great deal of Japanese electricity. Industry is concerned about price. So if industry has anything to say about it, perhaps nuclear power will stay in its current form without any kind of reduction. When I was in Tokyo last summer, there was no doubt that everyone was prepared to do their part to save energy, right? Because that was when we had to make 15% reductions on 19 nuclear reactors. This summer, there will be 15% reductions again on no nuclear reactors, right? And even though people were prepared to do their part, there were still examples of vigilantism on the part of people who would like throw things at buildings, who let their lights on overnight. I mean, that happened last summer. So being prepared to accept these costs, I think, has a shelf life. And so we'll have to see over the next year or two how long that shelf life lasts and what people are prepared to tolerate in terms of nuclear power. From an energy security standpoint, the best thing is for nuclear power to remain. I've argued that fossil fuel imports are not ideal. Renewables don't seem to be realistic in the medium term. But of course, this does remove the very human face of what happened on 3/11. There is a great deal more political activism surrounding nuclear energy now. And some people like Dan Aldrich have argued that nuclear power will never be able to make a comeback because of this rising activism on the part of the Japanese people. Where you've got citizen science, citizens building their own Geiger counters to keep an eye on radiation levels in their own communities. He argues that will change forever the way nuclear power policy is made in Japan. For him, nuclear power was always the brainchild of the old way of doing things in Japan, the Iron Triangle, right? This was top-down directives coming from the government, coming from METI, and working with industry, right? And he argues that this has been smashed by this rise of activism, citizen activism, post-3/11. If this is true, this will likely galvanize a push for renewables, but even if the renewables take off, that will still have to be met in the medium term, at least until 2020, with an increase in fossil fuel imports. This has implications for Canada as an energy exporter. This does, I suppose, theoretically at least, reinforce a Western orientation for our energy exports. We have often thought about exporting hydrocarbon resources to China only, because China seems to block out opportunities in Japan and South Korea. Japan and South Korea are the world's largest consumers of LNG and will remain so for the foreseeable future. So if we decide to export LNG from British Columbia, which is still obviously to be determined, there's a reason to do it that is not China, it is Japan and South Korea. And Japan, of course, is interested in producing Canadian resources. Just yesterday, there was a deal with a Japanese company and an Australian company to produce more coal out of British Columbia. So that relationship is strong and will continue to work. And of course, Canadians are less suspicious about Japanese and Australian investment than they are about Chinese investment. But given that Japan certainly, China certainly, and South Korea to a certain extent look at energy as a security question, and if diversification of import source is a way to secure energy price, then Canada may have a role as an LNG exporter as a source of import diversification away from China, Indonesia, the Middle East, and Russia. So just one final point, because I know I'm getting a look from OK. One final point. I've been a bit pessimistic here, but if there's one country in the world that can actually pull this off, it is Japan. They've pulled it off before with the reduction of oil consumption in the 1970s to 1980s. If any country has the technological wherewithal and the national drive to do so, it is Japan. Japanese people are becoming, I suspect, pretty disillusioned with their leadership and perhaps skeptical of the competence of their leaders. But Japan has done this before, and so I would suggest that there is at least some grounds for optimism on that basis, and I'll leave it there.
Great. James, thank you very much. I want to just one quick comment. Congratulations to David Welch for organizing this panel. I think it's given us a terrific insight and oversight into this large issue of energy security. We started off with a very interesting presentation of what we can expect from reports and the concerns from within, and an independent assessment, which will undoubtedly carry us forward for some time, and there'll be a lot more coming out, and it's not going to be straightforward. There will be contested views and interests on the table. John gave us, I thought, a masterful overview on the global governance implications, some of the challenges and opportunities, some of the failures and successes, and hinted at some lessons to be learned, and I know he's got a longer list than he presented to us. And now James, in terms of looking at it from within, but not only from within Japan, but within the regional context as well, and thinking through the different aspects of what energy security is all about. There's this phrase that we all know that's been around for a long time about a crisis as a catalyst for new thinking, a catalyst for innovation, a catalyst for risk-taking, managed risk-taking in terms of addressing new challenges. And perhaps with all the tragedy that has been around as a result of that triple event that occurred a year ago, good things may well come out of it that we'll all learn from. And now Julia is going to take us to the next step in this discussion, and then we'll have some time to open it up for further comment.
Okay, so thank you very much to the three panelists for both interesting and informative presentations that have included a number of different topics for discussion. I would, however, like to pick up on some of the concluding points surrounding the influence of civil society, the rise of political activism surrounding nuclear energy, the pursuit of information by the Japanese public, and the distrust of the existing institutions reporting on the disaster that led to the creation of the independent investigation that we just heard about. When the earthquake and subsequent tsunami triggered a nuclear disaster just over a year ago, it was obvious that what would follow would be worldwide concern over the future and safety of nuclear energy. First, I would like to talk briefly about the impact that the events at Fukushima had on the Canadian public's opinion about nuclear industry in order to sort of round off the discussions to include the local impact. And then I'd like to pursue a discussion surrounding the role that political activism and public opposition might play in the future of nuclear energy in Japan, and the ability of international institutions to govern. Canada has had a fairly vocal anti-nuclear movement since the 1970s, including actors like Greenpeace, the Sierra Club, and Energy Probe, and a public opinion that has consistently opposed the use of nuclear power. I was particularly interested in observing the reaction in Ontario, as nuclear power has been the foundation of its energy since the 1960s and produces or generates 52% of Ontario's energy. The damage to Japan's Fukushima plant was sure to cause concern here, as images of nuclear incidents provoke an unparalleled type of fear. The Canadian nuclear industry was forced to respond quickly across regional, national, and international levels to what was expected to be an only increasing concern about the future or the safety of Canada's nuclear facilities. Immediately after the disaster struck, Canada's nuclear companies launched a thorough assessment of their systems and operations to confirm their safety. On March 25th, 2011, the Ontario Power Generation, in response to the request by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission regarding the general nuclear safety and control regulations, confirmed its commitment to review the initial lessons learned from the events, from the disaster in Japan. They committed to re-examine the cases for Darlington, Pickering A, and Pickering B nuclear power plants, with a focus on seismic, flooding, fire, and extreme weather events, the measures for prevention and mitigation of severe accidents, and emergency preparedness. In October of 2011, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission concluded that all Canadian nuclear power plants are safe, with facilities designed to withstand conditions similar to those that happened at Fukushima. In March of 2012, the International Atomic Energy Agency concluded that the CNSC's response to the March 2011 events were prompt, robust, comprehensive, and should be emulated by other regulatory bodies. However, despite the reassurances communicated by the industry, Canadian public opinion was affected by the crisis in Japan. After the initial shock of the disaster, the Canadian Nuclear Association polled the Canadian public to identify their overall feelings towards nuclear energy. In June of 2011, 3 months after the onset of the disaster, nuclear energy was opposed by 56% of Canadians. And this overall opposition to nuclear energy was a slight increase from the 54% who opposed it the previous year. For comparative purposes, US polling numbers showed that 62% of Americans supported the use of nuclear energy post-Fukushima. So it didn't take long for people and governments alike to realize that this disaster would be compared to and held alongside such shocks as 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. And yet the events that subsided in Japan were particularly disconcerting, as they occurred in a technologically advanced democracy with long-established reactor designs. And therefore, many people in Canada, and Ontario specifically, questioned whether this would impact Ontario's existing plans to expand and refurbish parts of its nuclear industry. It did not. This month, Ontario Power Generation awarded a contract to SNC-Lavalin and Aecon Industrial to continue to roll out the government's long-term energy plan to refurbish the 4 existing reactors at the Darlington Nuclear Station, and reaffirmed its commitments to building 2 new reactors. Okay, so now moving back to the discussion, the Canadian Nuclear Association has polling evidence to confirm that the events on 3/11 led to an increase in opposition to nuclear power in Canada, despite the fact that it was not directly impacted by the disaster in terms of fallout or radioactive contamination. It is near to impossible for the situation in Japan to be replicated in Ontario, and Ontario's regulatory bodies demonstrated a proficiency in which the World Centre of Cooperation in the Nuclear Field believed ought to be emulated around the world. And yet there was still pushback. Japan, on the other hand, has suffered greatly, which leads me to believe that the domestic opposition will be stronger and much more robust. In fact, there are polling numbers which show that in November of last year, 70% of the Japanese public wished to see nuclear power eliminated or reliance on significantly reduced compared to 28% prior to the crisis. So while I do agree that the overall assumption that Japan's energy future must contain nuclear power, I also believe that the human face of this disaster should not be looked or understated. And I believe that if you were to ask many citizens of Japan, especially those who lived within the direct path of this triple disaster, I'm almost certain that they themselves would not be as convinced or less committed to a Japanese future that includes nuclear energy. The psychological and physiological trauma associated with the events that began on March 11th has given rise to community-driven, small-scale energy alternatives, mass protests, and a demand for greater transparency within the industry. So my question for the panel revolves around the fact that this disaster has undoubtedly had a major impact on public opinion within Japan, as little has been done to alleviate some of the fears of the public. And I'm wondering if you could comment on how this shift in public opinion and rise in political activism will affect the Japanese government's ability to pursue any type of investments in refurbishment and expansion in the future. And given Japan's guaranteed need, or arguably guaranteed need, for nuclear energy policies in the short and medium term, both in regards to diversifying its energy sources and cutting greenhouse gas emissions, how does it mitigate the fears of the public and operate effectively in a volatile environment? And more directly, Professor Kirton, I was hoping that you could comment on what it's been like for other G8 member countries who are forced to operate within a domestic political environment with a public and civil society that is very much opposed to the policies that it is pursuing, and how and if the changing nature or environment in which countries operate because of globalization and the increasing role of civil society will impact the G8's overall ability to govern global energy.
So we have a good amount of time. I just ask you to at least at the beginning, introduce yourself, since some people have come late and I know not everyone has a chance to meet each other. So just give us your name and from where you are coming from, and then please either your comment or your question to one or more of the panelists, and we'll make sure that they have access to these mics.
Thanks,
David.
Balsillie School. Thanks to all the panelists. I thought that was an extremely rich set of presentations and some good comments as well. I'm wondering about the counter-narrative. Is anybody mounting the counter-pro-nuclear narrative in Japan? A narrative that basically says if this is the worst that happens as a result of a triple disaster, unforeseen old nuclear plant, inadequate preparations to deal with this kind of thing. Nevertheless, this is at the end of the day a story about the reliability of nuclear, because no one died. And every year 300,000 people die globally from particulates emitted by fossil fuel electricity generation. Is anybody mounting that case in Japan now?
Thank you very much for your question. As far as I'm concerned, I don't think there are any prominent scholars or public intellectuals arguing for the aggressively for the continuation of nuclear power, because even though that there have been no real casualties from the Fukushima, from the radiation of Fukushima, it has taken the very livelihood of many of those who lived around the Fukushima Daiichi Nuclear Power Plants. And almost every day, if you watch the NHK National Hosokyoku, which is like the main Japanese television station, you would see the image and the videos of people who used to do farming near the Fukushima Daiichi, but now they don't have the land anymore, so they basically lost their livelihoods. There are those who received money for compensation, but they have nowhere else to go, so they just spend it all on pachinko, and then now they're homeless again. And when you keep seeing these images of the people who is still alive but being affected by the nuclear accident, I don't think there would be, at least as far as I know, there are no counter narratives talking about how Japan should, how Japan should continue with the nuclear power plants if this is the worst that could happen. At least that's my understanding.
I would just add that I think you're probably right. It's political suicide at this point, but that narrative is going to have to get told at some point, because at some point they're going to have to decide what to do. Do you take out, decommission old reactors? Yeah, I have no idea what that looks like. And what we might find, if I could speculate totally, is that it would come out in the context of a report, right? This new energy security strategy is going to get written, and it will have to, somebody's going to have to put their name on it, and, you know, as an author or as an agency, and that's how that position gets articulated. And then it's for public discussion, public consumption, and the sparks will fly, I imagine.
Very quickly, I begin with the fact that in Japan, well, the simple answer to the question is, if there is a counter-narrative, I haven't noticed it when I was in Japan or over here. So you could always probably find one or two tenured professors somewhere, but they're not a matter of political consequence anywhere that I've encountered. In the first instance, you've got the Donald Rumsfeld problem of the unknown unknowns. So the worst case scenario, right? In a sense, they're cognitively known and calculable, right? But Fukushima was a convergence of things that had been, in a sense, unimaginable. So if we're caught by surprise by unknown unknowns, once it's, you need a reservoir of, I think, safety or aversion before you go in. Secondly, to James's point, let me suggest that the decision may already been made, or it's a non-decision. The non-decision is simply not to restart.
Yep.
And of course, nobody's going to say, well, we've only got 2 left. Let's suspend the normal shutdowns, the pre-Fukushima. So I think they're going to go down, right?
Yeah.
So who's going to restart? And even in, what is it, Fukushima, the most pro-gung-ho, pro-nuclear part, it's still an open battle, right? Whether those are going to come online again. So you're down to 1 of, is it 52? So I think the revealed preference is a non-nuclear Japan within the next few months. And then what politician, you mentioned even some of the governing parties, honorable members are having doubts, but with the party fragmentation, with all of the old mainline parties and all their factions, living in political fear of some folks from Osaka capturing the national government. Who's going to take the political risk of standing up for a nuclear power in Japan now, especially? And I think this begins to bear on Julia's question. I mean, the local civil society activism. Civil society in Japan historically has not been as we assume it is in good old Greenpeace Canada or you know, the World Wildlife Federation in the United States. But when it's every, may I say, housewife or house husband, right, who has the aversion, that's not just an environmental NGO, it seeps throughout society. So I think that's where the, in a sense, it's civil society-wide non-activism. It's just not, no, don't even think about it, and politicians cue off of that. So my guess is that's the dynamic we're seeing right here, right now in Japan, which means you can go through the simple solutions. This is beyond the rational calculations. If Jean Chrétien were the Prime Minister of Canada, our greatest traveling, so buy can-dos, you know, that's the simple solution. But no. I suspect we really do have to think more seriously about a non-nuclear Japan, because I think that's what we could well be likely to get.
But what would the story be if the backup power generators for the cooling system had been on high ground as they should have been? Right? The containment vessels were intact, the reactor cores were intact, the cooling ponds were intact. Right? What would the story be now if they had just put the backup generators up on high ground and reconnected them within 30 minutes?
It would have been a very different crisis.
Japan would be hurtling towards 50% nuclear power generation, I presume. Yeah. Look at how safe this is. Took a direct hit from an unprecedented tsunami. Took a direct hit from a 9.0 earthquake. And in 30 minutes, the cooling system was back up and running.
I think what's just one final point that came out of what John said, just really quickly. What's interesting is you've got this unique situation in Japan with a rise of civil society and a more active public opinion at the same time where the traditional way of making policy in Japan has slowly been sort of coming apart since DPJ came to power, but also now this apathy about the 2 main parties. And so what's interesting is whatever the policy is, however this policy moves forward, it will be in a way that I don't think we've seen before in Japan, I guess. I mean, you think of Japanese politics being a function of interest groups and things like that, and those interest groups now don't have the audience in government perhaps that they used to because of the lack of public confidence in both parties. So it's just a really interesting change in the political landscape, that's from my perspective.
Other questions or comments around the table? Yes, please. Here's a microphone coming right around. Just take a moment to introduce yourself for everyone else, please.
Keith Heipel, is it on? Yeah, Keith Heipel, I'm here with CG as a senior fellow, also in systems engineering and connected to Renison College. Very excellent presentations, I really enjoyed them, thank you. I'm wondering if we can sort of take a lot of confusion out of the problem, if we make it clear sort of the physical systems constraints and the physical system solutions. So for example, we know that the only way we can handle a large amount of electricity for the next 50 years is using nuclear. That's very clear. Otherwise, we have to have cutbacks in lifestyle and everything else. We know that perhaps it can only go up to about 20% renewables. We know that if we continue with the fossil fuels, the climate change effects in Japan will be far worse than the nuclear leaks. So we have to somehow make more clarity in what the physical systems responses are going to be, because the confusion is in the social systems and how we're going to have a policy to handle that. And I think there's still so much confusion out there about the physical systems, you know, both the solutions and the effects, whereas in fact, that's fairly well known. We know what these effects are going to be. We know we need about an 80% cutback in fossil fuels in order to cut back in greenhouse gases. So let's take the confusion out of there and then try to, you know, get our social systems to react and respond appropriately.
James, you wanted to respond to that?
I was just going to say, one of the fundamental differences between our business and your business is that our units don't respond to laws like gravity. I mean, we can't, it's going to be hard to make the social systems react in a way that we want them to. I mean, I don't think that's something we can do as the policymakers can achieve, right? I mean, having a rational debate about science in the technical aspects of this is going to be very difficult to achieve, is I suppose my point.
Well, it's a great investigation. We know what the effects are and everything else.
Yeah. Can I just very quickly, I think you're right, between society and physics stands policy, right? We've long known that if you want to enhance energy security, you have to do three things in this order. The first is reduce demand, which you mentioned, right? So we were reminded last night that Japan's population under current projections might go from 179 million to 90. If you can just hold per capita energy increase at levels now, you've got 25% of your energy security problem solved. It's an aging population. How would we design policy, and there's a physical as well as a social dimension, so that all the retirees in Japan live an increasingly lower per capita energy consumption, right? So that's one, combine the population with the resources, the technology. That's one of the big design questions, right, where I would start. The second one, of course, is reduce waste. That's energy efficiency, right? And we do have the great opportunity of all the buildings and the physical infrastructure and the electricity power grids that were wiped out. We can rebuild those with 21st century technology starting right now. Smart grids to wheel power from anywhere in Japan to anywhere else, right? And if you can find a, I don't know, an onsen that's not in a national park that nobody's ever seen, you can wheel it all around, although there's more to be said about onsens there. And then reconfigure supply. And let me just throw something out there. I think David Welsh properly mentioned all the people that die from killer coal. The biggest killer on the planet are non-communicable diseases, especially for aging populations. The body count's 36 million. One of the risk factors or things we should do is exercise more. If you move the transportation system in Japan, where more people, and they can given the climate, were riding bicycles I mean, we all have this image of you move from bicycles to motor scooters and then to automobiles in terms of Asian and other development. But that's a supply side transportation part of the solution. But if you can rebuild your infrastructure, you know, bike lanes from scratch, there's a lot of ground zero or baseline zero opportunities for policy to produce the physical infrastructure going forward, right, to help solve the problem.
I think we have time for one more comment or question from anyone. Yes, please.
I'm Kane Yoshitomi from Japan National Defense Academy. Thank you for your presentation. And when I think about the problem of nuclear reactors in Japan, many people focus about the energy supply. But from point of the security, from security point of view, there is another aspect, I suppose. And well, Japan has a long history of nuclear industry, and it means Japan has various knowledge about the nuclear. And in the Japanese history, we contributed to the to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons and proliferation of nuclear devices. So now the Secretary General of IAEA is a Japanese. I believe it's not because of the Japanese nuclear industry, but it's because the Japanese contribution to the various aspects of nuclear. So, well, if Japan stop the Japanese nuclear industry, Japan will not be able to contribute to the nuclear security in the world. So when we, I believe when we think about the future of Japanese nuclear, another aspect means another point from the nuclear energy supply will be necessary, I suppose. Thank you.
You touched on a very important point. I mean, if people are concerned about the future of nuclear energy, Japan moving away from nuclear energy does not mean nuclear energy will stop, and it will. China and India's nuclear energy plans are significant, and if the interesting thing is, you know, if Germany and Japan both step back from nuclear energy, then the balance of nuclear expertise in the world is Chinese and Indian. Just gonna let that sit with you. Doesn't make me comfortable. So, I mean,
Akira or John, anything on this point?
I think it's a good point, but again, in a broader sense, I think a question we need to consider is whether or not most countries, particularly after a Fukushima-like shock, can say no to nuclear weapons and yes to safe, civilian, climate-friendly, civilian nuclear energy. Thinking across my G7 comparisons, Germany says no, no, and the reason they're going out of nukes, I think, is related or clustered with their profound aversion to nuclear weapons, right? And the as-ifs going back to Dresden firebombing and such like. Then right next door, you've got France, which is a yes, yes, right? At the end of the day, I think the United States, despite the 30-year sabbatical from 3 Mile Island, despite Obama's initial aversions, I think the United States will turn out to be, because they've started recommissioning and building, it'll be yes, yes to the weapons and the civilians. But I think Japan is so profoundly no on the nuclear weapons, right? That there's an easy transposability in political culture to make it easier post-Fukushima to go the no reactors. Could one still have, in all those magnificent research reactors and university departments of whatever, enough functional contribution to support Japan's leadership in global governance and the IAEA and other multilateral organizations we might construct without 52 or even 5 plants pumping out what can be high-cost watts, right? That's the tragic story of Ontario. Nothing going boom, but a lot of plants producing billion-dollar bills for the taxpayers, right, Julia? And a lot of units offline for many years.
Yes, Akira, last word to you.
Right. Thank you for your question. I think you're right that Japan's contribution has been significant in the area of nuclear energy, so that if Japan stops using nuclear energy, then Japan won't be able to contribute to the world in terms of peaceful use of nuclear energy. But my opinion is that from the point of view of the public, whether to continue to rely on nuclear energy for its future energy needs will not be decided on whether Japan can contribute to the international community, but whether Japanese people can feel safe about relying on nuclear energy. So I think these are two separate issues.
Before we break, let me, on behalf of all of us, thank our 3 panelists and Julia as a discussant for really what I thought was a superb beginning of the day. Well presented, thoughtful, rich empirically and conceptually. I was hesitant, but now I'm kind of provoked to at least leave you with one complex thought. That about 40 years ago, a nuclear physicist and systems engineer from Germany, then working in the United States, named Wolf Hefele, talked about the dilemma of hypotheticality when thinking about the design of nuclear power plants and nuclear technology, in the sense that you wanted to try and create a system that worked. You needed to try it out. But the consequences of being wrong in the world of nuclear engineering could be catastrophic. And so you were kind of tied into this dilemma of the hypothetical, that you saw the need to move forward, and you needed to move forward and manage the risk. But God forbid, even if the risk was only infinitesimal, if you were wrong, the consequences would be extraordinary. David Welsh's question about the counter-narrative is, in a sense, an aspect of that. How do you think this through so that you manage the risks of something that is so vital for modern society? And it seems to me that we're still left with this profound challenge, because any decision that's going to be made around energy infrastructure, around energy use, around the expectation of your society, these are things that are made at a particular time, but they have long-term consequences. They require enormous investments, investments which often become very difficult to redirect if you find that the decisions you made were perhaps inadequate or wrong. And I think that's one of the dilemmas that this panel has pointed out, that Japan, like every society, but in particular Japan, since that's what we're focusing on now, and we have the benefit of the tragedy of last year that has forced us to think about this crisis as catalyst, we really are in this situation of the hypothetical, where decisions must be made. We don't really know with any certainty of the consequences of choosing option A over B, C, or D. And we're going to have to keep iterating through the process of revisiting those decisions and managing the consequences. So I think, from my perspective, I've learned a great deal from this brief panel, and that's always a nice thing to walk away from, being able to say you really got some new information, some new insight, and a new way of framing what some of the problems are. And for that, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank the three panelists, the discussant,